For those of you that don't know me, my name is Melanie Brooks, and I'm the audience coordinator at the BDN, and I work at creating these online events about once a week, usually, typically. So welcome to our event tonight. We're happy to partner with the Bangor Historical Society to bring you an awesome presentation about Bangor's lumber boom. I want to begin this event by thanking our event partner, Harvard Pilgrim Healthcare, and our subscribers. We're so honored and happy to have the support, and due to it, we're able to bring you these events and keep our local journalists working on the stories that you guys count on, that you guys love reading. So thank you all for subscribing to the BDN. And you may have noticed that you're muted. Please keep yourself in this mode during Ryan's presentation. If you have questions, please send them in using the chat function. And I'm going to take a minute in just a second and send you all a welcome message there. There's a little button with a chat bubble at the bottom of your screen. And if you have questions as we go through, leave them there and we'll get to them at the end of the presentation. So I'd like to take just a minute to introduce our special guest. Ryan Hews is a Bangor native and longtime history teacher. Ryan is a volunteer and historical tour guide for the Bangor Historical Society. He's currently teaching American history and serving as head of the upper school at the Hun School of Princeton in Princeton, New Jersey, though he spends his summers in Maine and helped to lead the group tours at Mount Hope Cemetery, the Best of Bangor Downtown Tour, and the Great Fire of 1911 Historic District Tour. So if you've been on a tour at the Bangor Historical Society, he might look familiar to you. The Lumber Barons of Bangor presentation is based upon a special tour he researched, and he presents at the Mount Hope Cemetery each summer. So before I let Ryan jump on and share his screen, I am going to ask you all for a favor. I want to be sure that this is the best presentation possible. And what we found in the past is if all of our guests turn off their video streaming, it makes it easier for the screen sharing and presentation to come through. So if you look at the bottom of your screen, there is a little stop video icon. And if you click it, like I just did, your screen will turn off. So if you wouldn't mind doing that, that would be super helpful. And then after our presentation, click it back on so we can see your smiling, happy faces, and we will get going. So remember, if you have questions, leave them in the chat and we'll get to them afterwards. And I'm going to pass it on over to Ryan to start sharing his screen and to start this presentation. So welcome, Ryan, and thank you so much for being here.
Thanks, Melanie. It's really great to be here with so many fellow Bangor Daily News subscribers. I'm really glad we were able to reschedule for tonight, and we have so many people here, and I'm really eager to share my research about Bangor's lumber barons, and I'm going to go ahead and share my screen so I can start the presentation. So Melanie, give me the thumbs up if we're good. You can see everything? Great. So welcome to today's history talk on the lumber barons of Bangor, Maine, presented by the Bangor Daily News and the Bangor Historical Society. I'm Ryan Hews, a volunteer tour guide for the Bangor Historical Society, and I'm really excited to share this presentation. We originally designed this as one of our theme-based tours at Mount Hope Cemetery. And so it's really great that given the new pandemic reality, we're able to partner with the Bangor Daily News to widen our audience and offer this look at Bangor's heyday as the lumber capital of the world. Those who have, are from the Bangor area or grew up here like I did have often heard of our hometown referred to as the one-time lumber capital or the Queen City of the East. But we suspect, like most of you, haven't really considered the implications of those descriptions or maybe some of the stories of the individuals that made it so. So today, what I'm going to do is share 8 stories with you. Some involving names that will be familiar to all of us, and others certainly deserve to be familiar because these are the people that literally built the foundations of our city and shaped the community of Bangor that we love so much. So let's start by understanding why lumber was so instrumental to financial success in the 1800s and why Bangor. So the key to the initial value of lumber in Maine is our state tree. You can see the state tree here, the white pine. These tall and strong trees were crucial to use as ships' masts. And the tallest and widest of these trees throughout Maine were marked originally with the King's Broad Arrow when the British controlled this territory to denote the King's claim on these trees. When you consider this, in addition to the fact that wood was not only a building block for structures throughout the world at the time, but also the primary heating source, you can see why lumber becomes such a commodity. I often tell my tours that it's important to think of lumber the way we think of oil today, and that should give you some sense of why there's so much value in these trees. And so our lumber barons, the families that we're going to talk about today, just like the robber barons of the Gilded Age that would follow them later in history, the Rockefellers, the Carnegies, the Morgans, our lumber barons are going to profit from a great timber age that happens in the mid-1800s. So the first white settlers in Bangor took advantage of ongoing conflict between the British-controlled Massachusetts government and the French, who had allied with Wabanaki peoples in eastern Maine. As Colin Wood had noted in his colony series earlier this year in the Portland Press Herald, the Massachusetts government began to systematically drive Penobscot and Passamaquoddy native peoples off the land that was theirs for thousands of years. And in the decade preceding the American Revolution, Maine's population doubled to 47,000 and then doubled again by 1790 as poor, land-hungry residents of southern New England came in search of new places to settle. So Bangor began as Kenduskeag Plantation in 1769, and from the start, lumber was key to survival. Records show the first sawmill on the Brewer side of the river in 1771, and sales of larger white pine trees beginning by 1786. As the value of this natural resources became more and more clear, the wealthy land speculators, whose influence over the Massachusetts State House was significant, these men pushed for surveys of Maine in order to separate and take advantage of the vast forest lands in this far-flung wilderness of the district. So you can see in this really great map from 1795 made by Osgood Carleton, you can see the grid design of these earlier surveys. And the surveys were designed intentionally to divide up the space to basically take advantage of the resources that were there. We can see it again in this 1829 map, famously made by Moses Greenleaf. In 1829, this map, not long after statehood, this was actually the survey that was created as part of Maine's statehood. So this map in particular shows how the primary purpose of these surveys was to promote the sale of these timberlands to land speculators. A key provision of the separation agreement between Massachusetts and Maine that allowed statehood to happen in the first place was the profit of the sale of these public lands to support the costs of separation. So when you think about it, sort of the development of Maine as forest land, as lumber territory, was instrumental in the creation of our state. So why Bangor? Well, as the furthest inland deepwater port in Maine, it's the natural collecting and deepwater distribution port for 8,570 square miles of forest land. You can see it here shaded in this image. And all of the rivers and streams that flow into the Penobscot thus become the transport system for this very valuable lumber coming from these forest lands. And Bangor lies right there at that choke point. I do want to mention here in the presentation, it's definitely worth noting that this entire shaded area we can see, and really all of Maine, were the ancestral lands of the Penobscot and Passamaquoddy, the Wabanaki people. And the lumber barons that we're going to meet today were essentially buying up lands that had already been resourced, occupied, and shared for thousands of years before the barons looked to profit from them. So these men, these families, these wealthy speculators that are purchasing this land, they're purchasing land that belonged to other people. It just didn't belong to other white people. And I think that's an important note before we get started. And similarly, I also want to acknowledge that the stories of the lumber barons that I'm going to share today, the lives of wealth and privilege, these lives were largely built on the labor of regular lumberjacks, immigrants and common woods workers of Maine who didn't build fancy houses on Broadway in Bangor or find a final resting place at Mount Hope Cemetery. You know, their work is what built both the fortunes of the families we're going to talk about and the city of Bangor as well. So I am going to save my last two stories for these everyday Mainers and how their association with the lumber industry was incredibly impactful. This image of these river drivers, these men, these river drivers were hired by the owners of the land, our lumber barons, and these men would work all winter to cut trees and then drive them to streams and rivers so that the spring thaw would drive the lumber to the mills where the trees could be cut into lumber for shipment. So you think about the really hard work these men are doing all winter long in the forests of Maine to sort of produce the lumber that can profit these lumber barons. All this lumber is going to come down the Penobscot and it will be then processed into lumber to be shipped out to other parts of the world. Here in this image, we can see the sheer number of logs clogging the Penobscot. And it's not hard to understand then why the population of Bangor is going to surge from all this economic activity. From 1791 to 1820, the population of Bangor grows 7 times, making it one of the fastest growing towns in the District of Maine. And that growth is all attributed to this lumber boom. I love this photo and this great photo from the Bangor Public Library's collection. It really provides us an interesting perspective because this is also the Penobscot River. And there's a building we can see on the shore here. You can see it right here. And this building still stands today. Looks exactly the same today, although there are a number of other buildings that surround it. It does offer us some historical context for what we're looking at. This is actually the Greystone building on the campus of Northern Lights Eastern Maine Medical Center. So the next time you drive by Northern Light Eastern Maine Medical Center, take a look and you'll see the Greystone building nestled in amongst all the other buildings from the development of Eastern Maine Medical Center over the years. But here we can see in this image, the logs just, waiting to be milled in the river just outside of the Greystone building. So by the mid-1830s, Bangor's infrastructure had grown significantly to support the lumber industry with mills and booms. Booms, by the way, are the log collecting islands that we see in the river. Some of them still are there today. So these were sort of man-made islands that would be used to gather the logs. They would hook chains to the shore and they could gather the logs in that way. And so Bangor's infrastructure had grown to support the lumber industry throughout Bangor and Brewer. And in this image that was taken in the 1850s, we can see the covered bridge that connected Bangor and Brewer, which is almost in the exact location where the current Penobscot Bridge is today. So it gives you some perspective. We're sort of looking at Brewer here, and we're looking basically from the site of what would be today the waterworks near Cascade Park. So we're sort of looking down the river. And basically, it's important to think about Bangor as a result. Look at all this lumber that's being milled here. And all of this lumber in the mid-1800s, as I mentioned, would be comparable to oil by today's standard. So when you think about that, Bangor is the Queen City of the East, much like Dallas or Houston would be the oil capitals of the US in the 1900s. And the impact of that wealth is absolutely comparable when we think about those comparisons. This image is a great image also from the Bangor Public Library's collection, and it really shows us the industrial process in one photograph. So we get logs from the river that are moved into a mill facility. You can see the logs being sort of put up the conveyor belt into the mill, and there in the mill, they will be milled into lumber that will then be loaded onto ships that sit waiting to sail out to the rest of the world with all of this lumber. And it's remarkable when you think about the fact that in the mid-1800s, there were more than 300 sawmills between Bangor and Old Town on both sides of the river, supporting upwards of 2,000 ships each summer and fall transport season. By 1872, we know from the records that exports of lumber had risen to as much as 250 million board feet of lumber every year. And all of that money, all of that lumber is money in the pocket of the lumber barons who own the land, the mills, and the shipping interests. And these are the families that I'd like to talk to you about today. The families who used this enormous wealth to become the leaders of the Queen City and build much of what we know of as Bangor today. So I thought I would start by sharing this famous map of Bangor in 1875. This is a bird's eye view map. They were very common in the 1870s and 80s. And the thing that's great about these maps is they're actually incredibly accurate. So the surveyors would actually go and sort of look at each house before they would hand paint these images. So they're actually quite accurate from the time period. And to provide some context of what we're looking at, the Hill House, which is the headquarters of the Bangor Historical Society on the corners of High Street and Union Street, is right here on this map. Main Street in downtown is right here on the map. And then the First Congregational Church, which is on the corner of Broadway and State Street, which is today where All Souls Congregational Church is located, is here. So that would give you some context if you're from the Bangor area to sort of see the map we're looking at. But I also thought it would be interesting so you could see where, in relation to each other, the robber baron families, we're going to talk about 5 robber baron families or lumber baron families tonight. And I wanted you to see where they lived. Some of their houses still stand. So there's the FARRAR family on Union Street, which is directly across the street from the Hill House, the Bangor Historical Society's headquarters. There's Abigail and Henry Prentice, who lived on Kenduskeag Avenue. And then there are 3 families that we're going to talk about tonight, the Hersey family, the Veazey family, and the DWINEL family, and all of them lived on Broadway. And so we'll talk about those men and their families as well. And we'll even get to see some of the images of their houses, some of which do still stand today. But one of the things that's really interesting that I found in my research is I started to see references throughout my research on these families and their businesses of their offices. And many of their offices were located in the same part of Bangor, in fact, on the same street. And there were a number of references in the documents to Lumber Lane, which would be the sort of street where all these offices were located, or also the Lumber Exchange. Similar today, we think about the Stock Exchange on Wall Street. The Lumber Exchange was the place where the price of lumber would be set. The price of lumber was determined by supply and demand, and the offices of these lumber barons would help determine the going rate on the Lumber Exchange. And so having your office adjacent to others was beneficial, and it resulted in Exchange Street. And the reason it is Exchange Street is because of that Lumber Exchange. So let's jump in and sort of look at some of our families. And I want to start sort of in chronological order looking at these families. And I want to start with 2 of the earliest rivals in the business that greatly shaped our growing community in the early 1800s and the 1830s in particular. So this gentleman, whose name is probably very familiar to many of you, Samuel Veazey, was born in 1787 in Portland, Maine. He made his first fortune by very clever use of rent that he took out on other ships. So he actually would buy steerage or stowage on other ships, and then he could rent that stowage to other people. So he actually rented ship space and then he rented that space to others to make a profit off of that. He was quite an entrepreneur even as a young man. He later bought into the Androscoggin River log boom between Topsom and Brunswick, but very quickly saw the burgeoning importance of the Penobscot River and how so much of Maine's forest land flows to Bangor and through on the Penobscot. And so he moved to Bangor, and in 1826, he bought the Jackson Davis Mill in Old Town and then continued to buy up mills on the river until he owned a total of 52 of those sawmills on both sides of the river between Bangor and Old Town. Now, keep in mind, you're talking about 300 mills maybe total over that time, and he owns 52 of them. So he definitely is one of our first real barons in this lumber industry. And later, Veazey, you can see here in this really great image from Deborah Thompson's book, The Architectural History of Bangor. This was Veazey's house in Bangor. It actually was torn down, but this house actually stood on the spot where the Family Dollar and the recently closed Walgreens sits, right on State Street across from right on the corner of State Street and Broadway, right across from All Souls Congregational Church. This house stood on that site. And Veazey was quite a businessman. He ended up buying a bank in Bangor. It was called the Bank of Bangor first. He renamed it after himself when he became the president and manager of the bank, called it the Veazey Bank. And we at the Bangor Historical Society actually have a Veazey banknote in our collection. You can see it pictured here, Veazey's face there on the 10-cent bill. And it was said that Veazey's fortune was so reliable backing up these dollars that they were taken as far away as California at the time. So one of the other things that Veazey did that he's very well known for is he purchased one of the earliest steam locomotives in the entire United States. The very first was only in 1834, and here we are in 1836, and Veazey buys up this railroad. It was a train that ran from Bangor to Old Town, hauling milled lumber and passengers from Old Town to Bangor. The company ran for 13 years until Veazey bought it. And then he extended it, built a bridge across the Penobscot and extended it over into Milford. And at the time, Veazey renamed it the Bangor, Old Town, and Milford Railroad. He continued to run it all the way up until his death in 1868. And his children continued to run the railroad until 1869, a year later, when it was bought by another railroad. Its path actually is still visible today. It's marked by stones with a V around Bangor. Here's a Google Map image of the rail route. You can see the black line is the railroad, and it runs right through city forests, and you actually can get a great view of the railroad bed from Interstate 95. So if you're going from the mall exits towards Broadway, and you look over to Essex Woods and the Essex Woods Marsh there, you can see what looks like a road right through the marsh. That road is the old railroad bed. So you can actually follow part of it for quite a distance. And I know there's some local historians who've done a great job of following up on that. In fact, the Coal Land Transportation Museum really kindly donated these stones that you'll see around Bangor. You can see two of them really visibly in Broadway Park. They have a big V on the stone, and that's because they mark the path of the original railroad. One of Veazey's other manipulations, which is probably even more well known, is the town of Veazey. He was upset at the taxes he was paying the city of Bangor for his country properties, as he called them, which actually happened to be a whole bunch of forest land on the edge of Bangor. And he used his political influence to get the state legislature to separate his town. And that's why we have the town of Veazey today. So as I mentioned, Veazey's home sits right there on Broadway. It did sit there on Broadway. And Veazey actually died in 1868 at the age of 80. His eldest son then took over the mills for many years, but his son John was not quite the businessman his father was. There was also a bit of an economic downturn at the time, and so that boom sort of expired. Veazey's buried at Mount Hope Cemetery, and he's buried in one of the first, actually there's only two in-ground tombs at Mount Hope Cemetery, and he's buried in one of them. Interestingly, just another little funny story about Veazey, he also would rent space in this tomb until he used it after his death to the cemetery corporation. So he was even making money off of his tomb before he passed away. So our second family is actually a great well-known character in Bangor's history, Rufus DWINEL. And Rufus DWINEL was Veazey's great rival and neighbor. He was equally as influential in early Bangor, one of the first millionaires in the community. DWINEL was noted to be quite the gregarious personality. He was consistently purchasing businesses and lumber interests and doing his best to one-up his rival lumber barons, especially Veazey. The great Bangor historian James Vickery used to share numerous stories of DWINEL's character and antics, how he used to provoke his rivals like Veazey by harnessing his horses to rush to business meetings, knowing that Veazey would be watching and follow him, only to return home after a leisurely trot through the city streets, just to vex Veazey. These ads that you can see in this image from the Bangor Journal and Democrat and the Bangor Daily Whig and Courier sort of show a little bit of, not only on the right-hand side, you can see the sheer amount of land that he was buying and selling over the course of a given year. These are all townships. He's selling acreage for forest land, for timber. And the one on the left, I find really funny. If you can read it, it basically is an ad that he posted in the newspaper in 1857, basically warning others to sort of stay away from his lumber territory and not mess up his lumber, his lumber territories, his stream water below the mills. and that he will hold all persons directly accountable for causing any obstruction to his land. So he was quite the businessman. And he actually lived in a home very much like this one that still stands on Broadway across from John Baptist Memorial High School. His house looked very, very much like this. But his house actually, and probably not coincidentally, was right next door to Veazey's house. And it is said that DWINEL actually built his house next to Veazey's 1 story taller to intentionally block Veazey's view of the river. So it sort of gives you a little bit of a note about his character. He's also buried at Mount Hope Cemetery. And although legend has it that he was buried in this sarcophagus because he was afraid to be buried, the truth is that the marker is in fact carved from solid Tennessee sandstone. So DWINEL is definitely interred beneath the monument, not in the sarcophagus. So let's move on to our third family, also a well-known Bangor name, Isaac and Caroline FARRAR. And they are 2 of the most influential citizens of the Queen City. They were part of really what I would say is the 2nd generation of great lumber barons. They're going to come along a little bit after Veazey and DWINEL, or at least they lived contemporary times, but Isaac's fortune is going to be made a little bit later than Veazey and DWINEL's. And they actually built the beautiful FARRAR Mansion, which still stands, one of the gems of Bangor to this day. And it still stands on Union Street, across the street from where we are at the Bangor Historical Society. So let's talk a little bit about Isaac and Caroline. Isaac was the son of a Skowhegan merchant and mill owner who eventually then moved to Dexter, Maine. And Isaac actually used his father's wealth. His father was a merchant, a shopkeeper, and he donated a lot of his money, or he bequeathed a lot of his money to his son. And so Isaac used that money to start buying up lumber and timberlands in northern Maine. So he's definitely a lumber speculator. And the wealth he accumulated from this work would result in the beautiful Italianate home that he built for his family. This home, which was completed in 1845, cost $10,000, which roughly would be about $253,000 today, maybe a little bit more. Was this Bangor Weekly Courier report. So in 1845, when it opened, the Bangor Weekly Courier, which was one of the weekly newspapers in the city, wrote this about the house. The first impression on entering the house is the idea of spaciousness. Nothing appears small or confined. There seems to be room enough everywhere. Then the neat, quiet richness and appropriateness of the cornices and other finishings, the ample stairway and massive railing, no part seeming like a public building, but domestic-like, fitting for a good substantial family, the successive generations of which shall maintain the mansion while the centuries pass. And of course, that has absolutely been the case. Isaac's office was actually located on Exchange Street, with a large market and warehouse building. And by 1855, he also had become president of the Maritime Bank, which gave him considerable lumber holdings and wealth throughout the region. He actually died very suddenly in 1860. And his wife, Caroline, you can see her pictured here. Caroline actually had amassed the largest private library in the city, and she frequently entertained Bangor notables like Hannibal Hamlin and national thought leaders of the day that she actually used her social influence to invite to the Queen City. She herself was a transcendentalist, and so she invited Ralph Waldo Emerson here to Bangor, and he spoke here in Bangor, actually visited with Caroline at the FARRAR Mansion as a result of that visit. So she also was very influential in politics as well. She was very close to Hannibal Hamlin, who we'll talk about a little bit later, went on to become vice president, obviously, in 1860. The FARRAR's son, Henry, actually graduated from Harvard and then fought in the Civil War as an aide to General John Sedgwick. So he was quite accomplished in his own right. After her husband's death, Caroline traveled the world, and she actually died in Italy in 1872. And then her body was transported back to Bangor, where she and her husband were buried next to each other right on top of the hill at Mount Hope Cemetery. Pretty much as high as you can go up at Mount Hope Cemetery is their final resting place. Two of my favorite stories from this time period as I did my research were Henry and Abigail Prentice, and they're equally impactful in Bangor's industry and social circles, and they were, along with the FARRARs, part of our second cohort of lumber barons. So Henry was born in 1809 in PEIRCE, Maine. He graduated fourth in his class from West Point, And after graduating, he became an assistant professor of math before he actually joined the Army down in Mobile, Alabama. And according to a Bangor Daily Wigan Courier article, Prentice was extremely physically fit, and to the point where the article mentioned that he walked from Mobile, Alabama, all the way to Bangor, where his parents were. Actually, his parents were in Paris, Maine at the time. So he allegedly walked all the way from Mobile, Alabama to Paris, Maine after obtaining leave. I'm not sure how true that is, but it was basically a tale told to share his supposedly extremely physically fit condition. He left the Army in 1835, and he moved to Bangor, where after a very short career in the law, he then decided lumber was where the money would be made. So he moved into the lumber industry. I'll talk about Abigail here in a minute, but this is his wife, Abigail. So as recounted by historian Ryan Robbins on his great website, bangorinfo.com, Henry and his new wife, Abigail, really represented the elite society of Bangor. They made their home, Elm Bank, they called it, the prime location for the who's who of Bangor to gather. This was the place you wanted to be seen for social gatherings. And on February 21st, 1871, they held what the Bangor Daily Wigan Courier called one of the, quote, finest parties ever given in the Queen City. The newspaper estimated that about 600 people gathered long into the night at the house, and the party was described this way. The array of rich and tasteful toilettes presented was bewildering, even to the eye of our reporter, who professes himself utterly unable to attempt a detailed description of the assembled loveliness. Excellent music was furnished for dancing, the supper was all that one could desire, and it was a long way into the morning before the last carriage left the hospitable doors. Notwithstanding the crowd of guests, the arrangements for their entertainment were made upon so generous a scale that the pleasure of all was fully anticipated, the entire house being thrown to the throng. It would hardly be sufficient to say that Bangor society was present en masse, and from 7 to 8 o'clock, the parlors presented a most brilliant appearance. So you can see this stunning picture of Elm Bank as it was back in the day. Interestingly, Elm Bank does still stand today on Kenduskeag Avenue. You can still see Elm Bank. You've probably driven by it and not realized its significance. Here's a picture from Google Maps, street view of the house today. Not quite in the same condition it was in back in the Prentice's day. But notice the doors on this image and still on the house. The original doors are still there on the house. So next time you drive up or drive through the Queen City and drive up Kenduskeag Avenue, do take a look for Elm Bank because it does still stand. Henry died in 1873 of a heart attack. In fact, it was quite sudden, there was no indication he was having any health issues. He died very quickly, and his wife actually found him in the bathtub. By the time he died, he accumulated substantial land holdings and had quite a land management business. His grandson would go on to leverage that wealth and form a partnership to form the company of Prentice and Carlisle that still exists today. So Prentice's funeral was held at Elm Bank on July 3rd, 1873. And they then held a parade from Elm Bank all the way to the top of Cemetery Hill at Mount Hope Cemetery, where they also planted an elm tree right behind the family monument. And the monuments you can see here in this image from Mount Hope, right up there on the top of the hill, beautiful spot for the family. Incidentally, Abigail lived many years after Henry's death, and she actually lived for some time with Henry's sister, who actually had also served in the Civil War as a nurse. She actually came down with an illness as part of that, and she died from that illness many years later, but she also is buried there with the family. Our fifth family, our fifth group of lumber barons, is oddly, I think, less remembered today, despite the enormous influence it had on Bangor and on Maine. Samuel Hersey was born in 1812 in Sumner, Maine. He graduated from Hebron Academy. He started business as a shopkeeper, first in Lincoln and then moved to Milford. And then obviously he was invested in the lumber business quite quickly. He saw the value of lumber and actually went out to Stillwater, Minnesota for a time, where he started his own lumber business there. And eventually then came back to Bangor as well. Hersey actually stayed in Bangor and left his eldest son, Roscoe, to run their family mills out in Minnesota. So there's actually Hersey lumber interests in Maine and in Minnesota at the same time. And there's actually a historic Roscoe Hersey house out in Minnesota that can be visited as part of their history. So Hersey stayed in the Bangor area, and in addition to owning all these timberlands, he would then go on to become president of the Market Bank in Bangor and got involved in politics. He was elected to the Maine House of Representatives and then became a delegate to the 1860 Republican National Convention, which ended up nominating Abraham Lincoln. So Hersey was actually involved in the nomination of Abraham Lincoln and was a very close friend and patron of Bangor politician and Senator Hannibal Hamlin. And so because the two men knew each other well and they worked together, it's quite possible that Hersey was instrumental in getting Hamlin on the Republican ticket in 1860 to have him run for vice president with Abraham Lincoln. Hersey was an unsuccessful candidate himself for governor of Maine in 1870, but he was then subsequently elected to Congress as the U.S. representative from the Bangor area, and he served in that position until he died. And this is an image of Hersey's house on Broadway in Bangor. It still stands, beautiful house still to this day. Hersey, you can see where the house is located here on the map. It's between Broadway Park and John Baptist Memorial High School, if you want to drive by and take a look. And one other note, Hersey actually left his entire fortune to the city of Bangor in his will. And the city would use that money to found the Bangor Public Library and build a new city hall, which unfortunately was demolished in the 1960s during urban renewal. He left the city 30% essentially of his estate. And that would be about $50 million that he left to the city, which is why when the city used his money to build the City Hall complex on Columbia and Hammond Streets, they placed his bust on the building. And you can see it here in this really great Bangor Public Library image of the dedication ceremony that took place of that building. He is buried right next to Vice President Hannibal Hamlin at Mount Hope in the Riverside section of Mount Hope Cemetery. So before we close and take questions, I do want to talk about two other families of import to discuss and see how widely influential lumber money was to the time. So lumber money did not just field the lumber industry itself. As we've talked about, there were banks and, these men used that money for other businesses, stores, shops, hotels. So the lumber money did not just fuel the lumber industry, but other fortunes as well. And one example of that would be the PEIRCE family, whose investments in forest lands in northern Maine allowed generations of the family great success. So Mellon PEIRCE, who was a lumber baron, and his investments in lumber allowed his son Waldo to pursue an artist's life. Waldo didn't have to work. Waldo got to pursue art as his career and actually studied in Spain and in France in pre-World War I Paris. He launched a career as an impressionist in that time. But by 1915, he also volunteered for the American Field Service Ambulance Corps, and he met Ernest Hemingway. You can see in this picture, the two of them here. As a result, they became very good friends. And he lived in Paris. He lived and painted and worked in Paris off and on in the 1920s. He became friends with many of the notables who defined that period in the arts: Gertrude Stein, James Joyce, John Dos Passos. And his canvases, his artwork is found in leading museums around the world today and in many private collections. And lumber money is what fueled his art education and allowed him to do that. He returned to Maine in the 1930s to focus on his family. Here's one of his famous paintings. It's called The Silver Slipper. This is a really interesting painting. He often would paint himself into his impressionist work, and he's actually in this painting, and so is Hemingway. Here's Hemingway sitting at the bar enjoying a beverage, and right next to him is his good friend Waldo PEIRCE. They're pictured there at the bar together. Interestingly, the PEIRCE family holdings included a space that still benefits all of us today. The property they donated to the city of Bangor after the Great Fire in 1911 would host the Bangor Public Library and the adjacent PEIRCE Park, the image we looked at earlier and we'll see again in a few minutes. And so that land was their land. That was where one of their homes was in that day. I also want to acknowledge the entrepreneurial spirit that the lumber industry inspired in all sorts of Bangor citizens, everyday folks. And most famously, Fan Jones. Many of you might have heard of Fan before. Fan Jones, whose brothel served the lumberjacks whose idle summers and money to spend made her a very, very wealthy woman. So these lumberjacks would come out of the woods after a long winter and they'd have money in their pocket, and Fan is going to take advantage of that. She opened a brothel in Bangor, and this is an example of a common woman whose entrepreneurial drive was, I would say, no doubt the equal of these robber barons, these lumber barons that we've discussed, and very much well worth remembering. This rare image of Fan Jones in her carriage at Pushaw captures her very spirited smile. I love this picture of her. The New England Historical Society describes Fan this way. She was born in Brooksville, Maine, sometime in 1830. She worked as a seamstress and possibly a servant for a wealthy family. It isn't clear how or why, but she became a prostitute in Bangor by 1850. And we also know that in 1858, police arrested her for operating a house of ill repute. She moved to another house at 233 Harlow Street. You can see I've located it on the map here, which is actually immediately across the street from the Margaret Chase Smith Federal Building, the little parking lot there right across the street. That's where that house stood. And it was only a short walk from there to the riverfront and the Devil's Half Acre. She was very shrewd with money. She bought the building herself and then basically painted the chimneys of the house blue so that the men in the woods would tell the story of this house in Bangor. You got to go to the house with the blue chimneys. That was the story that was told at the time. It was the most successful, longest running brothel in the city in those days. And so Fan was quite the entrepreneur and quite successful in her pursuits. By the mid or late 1860s, she became the common law wife of a man named John Thomas. He was actually an ex-convict, and he actually moved into the house with her there and helped run the business. And Fan then started going by the name Mrs. Thomas at the time. They may have actually been married. We don't know for sure, but we know that by any state, they were common law, husband and wife. The sky blue house actually survived the Bangor fire of 1911, but by then Fan was 81 years old and had very likely retired. She died of tuberculosis in 1917, like many Bangor citizens did, and she was allegedly then laid to rest in Mount Hope Cemetery. So interestingly, you can see this plot was purchased by John Thomas, probably using Fan's money. There is no stone to Fan, but we believe Fan is located between the little baby's grave with the dove and John Thomas's grave here. So I find it really interesting that Fan found a way to have her family, so to speak, buried alongside Bangor's finest citizens here in Mount Hope Cemetery. It speaks highly of her spirit and her drive. So I just want to end by saying that we started this afternoon by acknowledging the lumberjacks and river drivers whose work and sacrifice made the Baron's fortune, Waldo Pierce's art, Fan Jones' business thrive. These workers, these common workers, made all of that happen. And so the last story I want to tell illustrates the type of sacrifice these men made, and it represents thousands of others whose toil and life stories aren't celebrated nearly as fully as they should be. And although it is captured here in the Pierce Memorial in Pierce Park, we need to know their contributions as well. As recounted in Eric Henrikson's excellent new book on the cultural and environmental history of Katahdin Woods and Waters National Monument, which appropriately celebrated its 4th birthday on Monday, comes this account of one young lumberman who was actually working on the river there in what is now the National Monument. His name was William M. Haskell, and he headed into the wilderness for a late log drive in June of 1841. And the logs were once again jamming on the east branch of the Penobscot River, which flows right through today's National Monument. And Haskell was sent to help free the jam. He was only 25 years old, and he was sent to walk out on top of the logs on the jam and free them from the jam, which was quite dangerous. And as soon as he walked out onto the log jam, it burst free, suddenly taking William and the logs along with them down the river. He was quickly washed downriver, becoming trapped in the cascading logs, and he drowned on June 19th of that year, 1841. His father and a Penobscot Native American guide recovered William's body on July 10th, and they buried him on the riverbank where they found him. And our new national monument, not only naturally beautiful, also protects and celebrates this lumber and cultural history as well. And it reminds us of the sacrifice of these common men to the fortunes of our barons and our city. And if you actually visit the northern end of the monument, which I did just a couple weeks ago, you can see this distinctive rock in the East Branch that actually, after Haskell's death, they named the rock after him. So this rock, Haskell Rock, was named for William Haskell and has a connection to our lumber barons, and to our lumber boom, and a connection directly to Bangor, because the logs that Haskell went to free, eventually found their way down the Penobscot River to Bangor and were shipped out from there. So I just want to say thanks to everyone for joining today and for sharing this time with us. And I specifically want to say thanks to the Bangor Public Library. I spent an entire summer there with the librarians in the Bangor room doing research for this tour, and the Mount Hope Cemetery Corporation, obviously. Also spent some time at the Patton Lumbermen's Museum, which is an incredible place if you haven't had a chance to see it up in Patton. And obviously the Bangor Historical Society that I love to volunteer for so much, and the Bangor Daily News for taking the time to share this evening with us. I also want to just mention some resources that fueled the research. So the Woodsman and Wiggs book that has historic images of Bangor has some great history. Also, Bob Cardin's Old VZ Railroad book, which you can actually purchase at the Coal Land Transportation Museum. Margot Cobb's great book, If Walls Could Talk, about the FARRAR Mansion. And then the book I mentioned, really great book. I highly recommend it, by Eric Hendrickson, Katahdin Woods and Waters National Monument. It's really an incredible book, not only about the history of the lumber movement in Maine, but also the monument, its cultural history, its natural history as well. And then a lot of research with Trudy Irene C's books, City on the Penobscot, Mount Hope Cemetery. She's an incredible historian and has offered so much to our area. So I'll stop sharing my screen. We can open it up to questions, and I'll do my best to try to answer if anybody has any follow-up.
Thank you, Ryan, so much. That was fascinating. I love old pictures. Feel free to come back on. Feel free to start your videos back up. Just a shout out for Fan Jones. A local woman named Monique Bouchard does a wonderful tour through the Bangor Historical Society as Fan Jones, called the Devil's Half Acre Tour. And if you haven't taken that tour, you should take it. It's wonderful. She does such a fabulous job. And she's a wonderful speaker and actress.
Yeah, she's incredible. I mean, the research that she's done is amazing. It puts you right back in the time. So
it does. And I'm not sure, Ryan, if you have done any tours live this summer, or if there are any planned for this fall.
Yeah, we actually have done a number of live tours. We've socially distanced and worn masks, and we've done tours at the cemetery and the Great Fire Tour, as well as the Best of Bangor. And there are still some tours left this season. So if you go on the Bangor Historical Society Facebook page or the website, you should be able to see the list of remaining dates for those. But they're really great opportunity to get outside and to enjoy some history. It's
a beautiful cemetery as well. We did have one question that came in from Chad, and he was wondering, maybe not these lumber barons, but maybe lumber barons a little bit later in history, was there any relationship between these lumber barons and the KKK in working together, either publicly or covertly?
Yeah, that's a really interesting question. It's entirely possible, although it would have been dangerous for them to do so, because the KKK in Maine, especially in the 1920s or so, would have been mostly an anti-Catholic organization because of the Catholic immigrants that were coming in, especially French Canadian Catholics that would have been coming into the Bangor area, or all around Maine, actually. And so if any of those were immigrants from Canada that were Catholic immigrants, it might have been dangerous for those lumber barons to discriminate against their workers in that way. But it's certainly entirely possible. Even the governor of Maine, one of the men who was running for governor of Maine at the time in the 1920s, was associated with the Klan. So it's entirely possible that there was an association. I don't know of any that I saw in any of the research that I did, and not of any of the Bangor lumber barons that I found in the research, but it certainly would have been possible.
We have a question from Conrad. He wants to know how Bangor's lumber industry was impacted by the Civil War.
Yeah, that is an incredibly good question. Basically, the Civil War had a devastating impact on not just the lumber industry, but pretty much every industry in the state. Maine's population was actually growing from its initial days all the way up until the Civil War. And then since the Civil War, it's stagnated. And a large reason for that would be the number of men that went to fight in the war. Maine sent, by one estimate, more men per capita than any other state to the battle, to battles, and many of those men Not only some of them perished in the war, but many of them saw a world outside of Maine they had never seen before, and then didn't return after the war. And in fact, many of them actually moved out west as the lumber industry started to shift westward right around the time of the Civil War. I mentioned Hersey's holdings out in Minnesota. That was a good indication of the growing market in the Midwest and then eventually in the West for lumber. So Portland, Oregon is named for Portland, Maine, because of the people that moved out there to pursue the lumber industry. So you can see the lumber industry moving across the continent. And as it moves across the continent, it sort of lessened here in this area. So the lumber industry really kind of turned its corner right around 1870s. So the boom time for Bangor is really 30s to 70s, with 40s and 50s being the primary time of profit.
Do you know if these barons sold any of their milled lumber to the government?
Most likely, yeah. So it was said at the time that Boston was built with Bangor lumber and Brewer bricks. There were a number of Brewer brick factories at the time. So when you combine that with the granite and the stone that's being shipped out of places like Prospect, the Penobscot River becomes quite a resource for natural resources for building materials that would be used to build buildings all across the eastern seaboard. So it's very likely that the government was purchasing lumber from these mills and the interests at the time.
Jason wants to know if these barons were doing anything at all to reforest the lands that they were harvesting, or was that just not a priority back then?
Yeah, that's a great question. I didn't find much in the research about that, although if you go to the Patent Lumbermen's Museum, they do have some interesting exhibits on that idea, or the question of sustainability and sort of reforestation. I mean, they were good businessmen, so they understood the resource could be used up. And so I think that they would have wisely understood that. But I think it's also important to remember the vast amount of forest we're talking about, which still today is the largest contiguous forest east of the Mississippi River. So when you think about how many trees there were to cut down, they probably weren't thinking primarily about that resource. But it is instructive for us to see one of the things that sort of turned the corner for Vesey's businesses early on was they ran out of the tall white pine. So there were like issues where some of the trees were being over harvested. So that actually did start to happen in some ways.
Nicholas wants to know when the paper making industry appeared in Maine.
Yeah, that's a great question. I don't know as much about that as I know about the sort of 1800s era, but I know that it is going to pick up when technology changes. You're going to have a change in the way the process works. So you're going to go from those mills where you're driving logs to the mills and then refining those logs. You're going to then start transporting those logs in other ways, on rail cars, on trucks, and that's going to change the nature of the business. And so once you end up with technology and machinery that can mass produce this lumber like we have today, it's going to change the business model, I think, pretty substantially. And so I would say, I don't know for sure, but my guess would be based on what you see, the transformation of the industry, it would have been in the early 1900s, right around the same time as the later industrial robber barons are coming on the scene.
We had a couple of questions that were emailed to me before this event about books that people could check out to read about Bangor's history. Do you have any that you can share? And just so that everybody knows, I will share the titles and authors of these books in a follow-up email, so you don't have to feel like you need to take notes.
Yeah, sure. So a couple of things I would say in terms of the lumber industry in particular, books that I used or that I've read that I've enjoyed. Nonfiction, I would say Robert Pike wrote a book called Tall Trees, Tough Men. That's a nonfiction account of the lumber industry. It includes most of New England, but a lot of it in Maine. There's a book about the entire lumber industry and how it spread across the country that's called Holy Old Mackinac by Stuart Holbrook. That's another good resource. This book actually also was a great resource. It's the Images of America series. This one's Logging and Lumbering in Maine, and it has incredible images, but also the captions carry a lot of history. This book is by Donald Wilson, Logging and Lumbering in Maine. And then in terms of fiction, I would recommend Barkskins, which is a really great fictional account of all the way back from the earliest settlements of French Canada, of the lumber industry. It's a novel by Annie Proulx, and that's really great. So those would be some things that just off the top of my head that I would recommend.
I know that the Bangor Historical Society has been doing other online presentations like this. What's the best way for people to find other presentations? Is it the Facebook page? Is it the website?
Yeah, that's a great question. So if you go on the Bangor Historical Society's Facebook page, there will not only be a list of upcoming presentations, but also there will be options to go back and watch past presentations as well. And, you know, I'd really love, you know, to have people join the Historical Society. It's an incredible resource for Bangor, and the history that we have in our city is remarkable. And for us to be able to tell more stories, and, you know, that's one thing that I was hoping that we could talk about is, you know, if people have ideas for other tours, or they have ideas for other presentations that we could do. We've been talking about potentially doing a presentation, maybe on Al Brady, for example. You know, things like that we'd love to know what would be some things that people would like to hear about.
That's great, and that's easy to find out. So I will be sending out a follow-up email with some of these links, a link to the Bangor Historical Society Facebook page and website, as well as the books that Ryan mentioned. And there's going to be a survey, and I will add that question, Ryan, to the survey to see if anyone has any other suggestions for historical presentations that you would like to see the Bangor Historical Society pick up. Actually, David Richards just said, for a fictional account of Maine lumbering, I would also recommend King Spruce by Holman Day. Another good book. Ryan, you have talked for practically an entire hour. Thank you so much for that. You deserve a tall glass of water. Thank you so much for this presentation. I can tell how much time and effort went into the research behind it. The maps were wonderful. The photos were great. And now I have to head out in my car and drive around Bangor to see if I can find some of these houses.
Well, I appreciate everybody coming. Thank you so much.
Yes, and thank you all for coming and spending time with us tonight. So happy to see you here. And please open up that email and let us know other ideas for topics. We're happy to hear your input, and I hope you all have a fabulous night. Thank you again, Ryan, and have a great night, everybody.
Thanks, everybody. Bye-bye.